September 15, 1940, 11:47 in the morning, 22,000 feet above the Kent countryside. Pilot Officer Colin Gray had a Messerschmitt Bf 109 dead in his sights. 400 yards, closing fast. The German pilot hadn't seen him yet. Gray's thumb hovered over the firing button, steady, confident. 3 seconds to kill range. Then Messerschmitt's nose dropped into a steep dive. Gray followed without hesitation, pushed his stick forward, felt the negative G lift him against his harness straps. For one perfect moment, he had the shot. The gun sight was locked, his finger tightened. His Rolls-Royce Merlin engine coughed once and died. The propeller windmilled uselessly in the slipstream. The gun sight drifted off target. 1,030 horsepower, gone in an instant. Gray's Spitfire became a glider. Below him, the Messerschmitt pulled out of its dive and vanished into the clouds. The German pilot didn't even look back. He didn't need to. He knew the British couldn't follow. Gray's engine restarted with a rough cough 2 seconds later. But his fifth kill had escaped. Not because of German skill, because of British engineering. He landed at Biggin Hill 20 minutes later and filled out the same maintenance report he'd filed twice before. Engine cutout during negative G maneuver, duration 2.3 seconds, enemy aircraft escaped. What if I told you this happened not once, not twice, but in 43% of every diving attack British pilots made? Nearly half, every single time. Gray's report joined 2,300 others in a filing cabinet at the Air Ministry. 2,300 documented engine failures. 2,300 moments when British pilots were helpless in the sky while German fighters circled back to finish them off. Somewhere in that stack of reports was the answer to why so many young men weren't coming home. But finding the answer wasn't the problem. The problem was that nobody could fix it. Nobody except a woman working alone in a laboratory at Farnborough. A woman most of the RAF had never heard of. And she was about to break every rule in the Air Ministry to save their lives. But I'm getting ahead of myself. First, you need to understand just how bad this problem really was. Flight Lieutenant James Lacey, September 3, 1940, engaged 3 Bf 109s over the Thames estuary, dove to intercept. The engine cut out for 3 seconds. Lost visual contact. No kills. Pilot Officer Geoffrey Wellham, September 11th, got on the tail of a Messerschmitt over Maidstone, pushed into a dive. The engine died. The Germans escaped. Wellham nearly collided with another Spitfire while his aircraft was powerless. Squadron Leader Douglas Bader, September 18th, leading 242 Squadron in formation attack. 6 Spitfires dove simultaneously on German bombers. All 6 engines cut out within seconds of each other. The German formation scattered while British pilots wrestled their aircraft back under control. 6 experienced pilots. 6 dead engines. 0 kills. This wasn't mechanical failure. This wasn't bad maintenance. This was systematic, predictable, and absolutely deadly. Every squadron reported it. Every airfield logged it. Fighter Command in southern England, the men defending Britain during its darkest hour, were flying aircraft that betrayed them at the worst possible moment. And the Germans knew it. Luftwaffe intelligence had figured out the British weakness within weeks of the first major engagements. Their after-action reports documented it precisely. Their tactical manuals taught their pilots how to exploit it. They even had a name for it: the English disease. The tactic was brutally simple. When a British fighter gets on your tail, dive. The Spitfire will follow. Its engine will cut out. You escape, or you turn around and kill him while he's helpless, gliding through the sky like a target at a shooting range. German pilots used this technique in every single dogfight, every single one, and British pilots died because of it. The Battle of Britain, fought between July and October 1940, saw 449 RAF fighter pilots killed. Not all of them died because of engine failures, of course. Combat is chaos. Bullets don't discriminate. But squadron commanders estimated that between 80 and 100 of those deaths, young men who had Germans in their sights, who did everything right, who should have come home, were directly caused by the carburetor flaw. 100 families receiving telegrams, 100 funerals, 100 futures were erased because an engine couldn't handle a dive. Britain's survival was hanging by a thread. Fighter Command was losing experienced pilots faster than they could train replacements. Every week the odds got worse. Every week the Luftwaffe pressed harder, and every week British engines kept failing. So what was actually happening? Why were the best engines in the world, Rolls-Royce Merlins, the pride of British engineering, betraying their pilots at 22,000 feet? The flaw was simple, devastatingly simple. The Merlin engine used an SU carburetor with a float chamber. Think of it like a tiny fuel tank inside the carburetor itself. During normal level flight, gravity pulled fuel down from this chamber into the engine. The system worked perfectly. Smooth power delivery, reliable, efficient. But combat wasn't normal flight. When a pilot pushed his stick forward and dove after an enemy, the negative G-forces, the same forces that lifted pilots against their harness straps and made their stomachs float, threw everything upward, including the fuel. The fuel surged to the top of the float chamber. The float, designed to regulate fuel flow, dropped to the bottom. The valve opened wide, and suddenly the engine was drowning in fuel. The supercharger flooded. The combustion chambers choked. The engine died. 1 second, sometimes 2, sometimes long enough for a Messerschmitt to circle back and put 20mm cannon shells through your cockpit. The Germans had no such problem. Their Daimler-Benz DB601 engine used direct fuel, injection, no float chamber, no flooding, no weakness. A Bf-109 pilot could roll inverted, dive vertically, pull negative G for 10 seconds straight, and his engine never missed a heartbeat. Let me show you what this meant in real combat. A British Spitfire pilot spots a German fighter. He has an altitude advantage. He dives to attack, but he can't dive straight down. His engine will cut out, so he has to do a half roll first, flip his aircraft inverted, then pull back on the stick to dive. This maneuver takes 2 to 3 seconds. Precious seconds where the German can see what's happening and react. A German Bf-109 pilot spots a British fighter. He pushes his stick forward. He dives straight down. No roll, no delay, no engine failure. He's on target in under 1 second. 2 to 3 seconds doesn't sound like much on the ground. But at 300 miles per hour, with bullets flying and fuel burning and your heart pounding in your chest, 2 seconds is the difference between life and death. British pilots called it the negative G problem. German pilots called it free kills. Fighter Command called it a crisis. And nobody could stop it. Rolls-Royce wasn't sitting idle. They knew about the problem. They'd known since 1937, during early test flights. Their engineers were brilliant. They understood physics. They had a solution. A pressure carburetor, a complete redesign of the fuel system using injection principles similar to the German engines. Proper engineering, proper testing, proper solution. Estimated completion date, late 1943. Late 1943. Britain was fighting for survival in 1940. The Luftwaffe was bombing London every night. The RAF was outnumbered, outgunned, and losing pilots every single day. And the solution was 3 years away. 3 years. Britain didn't have 3 years. They were losing the war now. But the Air Ministry had procedures, protocols, safety requirements, testing regimens. New aircraft modifications required 6 months of evaluation, review, committees, engineering boards, certification processes, endless paperwork that moved at the speed of bureaucracy while pilots moved at the speed of sound. Squadron commanders filed reports, begged for a fix, sent urgent requests up the chain of command. The reports landed on desks in London where men in suits debated whether the problem was really as serious as the pilots claimed. Men who'd never felt a Merlin engine die beneath them at 20,000 feet. Men who'd never watched a German escape because their aircraft betrayed them. men who went home to their families every night, while pilots died in burning wrecks over the English Channel. The complaints mounted, the death toll rose, and nothing changed. Until a file landed on the desk of someone who refused to wait. The answer wouldn't come from Rolls-Royce with their 3-year development timeline. It wouldn't come from the Air Ministry, drowning in committees and procedure. It would come from someone nobody expected. Someone who'd been told her entire life that she didn't belong in an engineering lab. Someone who'd been racing motorcycles at 106 miles per hour while other women served tea and took notes. Someone who was about to risk everything, her career, her reputation, maybe her freedom, to save pilots she'd never met. Her name was Beatrice Shilling. And if you want to see how one woman's genius solved what an entire industry couldn't, hit that like button right now. This story gets wild. Trust me. Stay with me. March 8, 1909, Waterlooville, Hampshire. A small market town where everyone knew everyone and everyone knew their place. Beatrice Shilling was born into a world with very clear rules about what girls could and couldn't do. Her father, William, was a butcher. Respectable work, hard work. The kind of work that kept a family fed but didn't open doors to universities or laboratories or anything beyond the ordinary. Girls from families like hers had 3 paths: secretary, nurse, or shopkeeper. Maybe you'd marry well. Maybe you'd work in your father's shop. But you certainly didn't become an engineer. Nobody told Beatrice that, though. Or maybe they did, and she just wasn't listening. At 14 years old, she took every penny she'd saved from odd jobs, cleaning, errands, helping at her father's shop, and bought a broken motorcycle. A Norton, rusted and dead, abandoned by someone who couldn't fix it. Her parents thought she wanted to ride it. They imagined her puttering around the countryside, the wind in her hair, a teenage girl's rebellion that would fade once the novelty wore off. They had no idea. Beatrice wanted to understand it. She dragged that motorcycle into her bedroom. Her parents must have been mortified, and began taking it apart. Not casually, systematically. Every bolt, every gear, every component stripped down to its smallest piece, laid out on newspapers spread across her bedroom floor. Her mother would come to the door and stare at the organized chaos. Oil stains on the floorboards, metal parts everywhere. Her daughter, covered in grease, consulting diagrams she'd sketched herself. "What are you doing, Beatrice?" "Learning." And she did learn. She learned what every part did. Why was it shaped that way? How it connected to the next piece. She learned by touching, by failing, by trying again. No textbook, no teacher. Just her, the engine, and an obsession with understanding how things worked. 3 months later, she'd rebuilt it. Not just reassembled it, rebuilt it better than factory specification. She'd identified weaknesses in the original design, made modifications, improved the timing, adjusted the carburetor mixture. When she kick-started Norton in her parents' garden, the engine roared to life with a sound that was smoother, stronger, more powerful than it had ever been when it was new. Her father stood in the doorway of his butcher shop, arms crossed, shaking his head in disbelief. Her mother asked, "What will the neighbors think?" Beatrice didn't care what the neighbors thought. She'd had a revelation that would define the rest of her life. Engines are just puzzles. Complex, beautiful mechanical puzzles. And I'm really good at puzzles. By 1934, Beatrice Shilling was 25 years old. She wasn't puttering around the countryside anymore. She was racing at Brooklands. If you don't know Brooklands, imagine the most terrifying motorsport circuit ever built. A concrete oval, steeply banked, where motorcycles and race cars reached insane speeds. The banking was so steep that riders had to lean their machines at 45-degree angles just to stay on the track. One mistake, one loss of control, and you'd slide into the concrete wall at 100 miles per hour. People died at Brooklands regularly. Beatrice pushed her Norton M30 to 106 miles per hour around that concrete banking. She earned the British Motorcycle Racing Club Gold Star, an honor given to riders who exceeded 100 miles per hour in a race. She was only the third woman in history to receive it. But here's what makes her story different from every other racer. She didn't just ride the motorcycle, she built it. She added a supercharger to her Norton M30 herself, designed the mounting, calculated the boost pressure, tuned the fuel mixture to handle the extra power without destroying the engine. She didn't hire mechanics. She was a mechanic. Racing taught her something no textbook ever could. It taught her how engines behave under stress, how they sound when they're about to fail, how they smell when components are overheating. She learned to feel problems before the gauges showed them, a slight vibration in the handlebars, a barely perceptible change in engine note, a hesitation in throttle response that told her something was wrong 3 seconds before it became catastrophic. She learned what metal sounds like when it's under pressure. She learned what fuel smells like when it's running too rich. She learned the difference between an engine that's working hard and an engine that's about to explode. One race, her primary chain snapped at 95 miles per hour. She felt it coming, a tiny vibration, a millisecond of warning, and she'd already begun easing off the throttle when it let go. She coasted to a safe stop while other riders would have crashed. Another time, her oil pressure started dropping mid-race. The gauge hadn't moved yet, but she smelled it. Hot metal. Friction. She pulled off the track immediately. 10 seconds. Later, the bearing seized. If she'd kept racing, the engine would have locked up at 100 miles per hour. Textbooks teach you theory, she'd later say. Racing teaches you survival. And survival, it turned out, was exactly what the RAF needed. In 1932, Beatrice Shilling enrolled at the University of Manchester to study electrical engineering. She was one of only 2 women in the entire engineering program. The professors didn't know what to do with her. Some ignored her. Some condescended to her, speaking slowly as if she couldn't possibly understand complex mathematics. One professor told her directly that engineering was too demanding for women and suggested she transfer to teaching. She graduated top of her class, but having a degree didn't mean anyone wanted to hire her. Engineering firms in the 1930s didn't hire women. They barely acknowledged that women with engineering degrees existed. She sent dozens of applications. She got polite rejections, or more often, no response at all. Finally, she found an apprenticeship with Margaret Partridge's electrical engineering company, one of the few firms in Britain run by a woman. Partridge understood what it was like to be brilliant and dismissed. She gave Beatrice a chance. For 4 years, Beatrice worked on electrical systems, motors, generators. She learned precision. She learned how to work within systems that didn't want her there. She learned to be twice as good just to be considered half as competent. Then, in 1936, the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough took a chance on her. The RAE was Britain's premier aircraft research facility. Wind tunnels, experimental engines, cutting-edge aerodynamics. 200 engineers working on the aircraft that would defend Britain if war came. And one woman. Beatrice walked into that building knowing she was the only female engineer among 200 men. Some of them welcomed her. Most of them didn't know what to make of her. A few called her the plumber behind her back and insults suggesting she was doing manual labor, not real engineering. She didn't argue. She just worked. By 1940, she'd become Principal Technical Officer for Carburetor Research and Development, not because anyone handed her the position, because she was the best person for the job, and even the skeptics couldn't deny it anymore. Then, in November 1940, a file landed on her desk. It was thick, heavy, thousands of pages of combat reports, maintenance logs, pilot testimonies. Engine failure after engine failure. Each report was stamped with a squadron designation, a date, a pilot's name. She read them all. She read the pilot names. Young men. I am 20 years old. 22. 25. Names followed by squadron numbers. Some names appeared multiple times. Pilots who'd survived one engine failure filed a report gone back up, and died in the next engagement. Dead men. Men who'd trusted their engines to keep them alive. Men who'd done everything right and died anyway, because the machine betrayed them at the worst possible moment. Squadron commanders were begging for a solution. Rolls-Royce was working on one, but it was 3 years away. The Air Ministry was drowning in paperwork and procedure, and Beatrice Shilling had 4 months to save the ones still alive. She closed the file, looked at the stack of reports on her desk, thought about those pilots, strangers whose names she now knew, whose deaths she could prevent if she worked fast enough. Then she rolled up her sleeves and got to work. January 1941. The laboratory at Farnborough was freezing. Britain was in the grip of one of the coldest winters in decades. Outside, snow covered the airfield. Inside, Beatrice Shilling sat at her workbench, surrounded by carburetor components, technical drawings, and 6 weeks of failed calculations. She'd been attacking the problem from every angle: complex redesigns, modified float chambers, alternative fuel delivery systems. Each solution was too slow, too expensive, or required parts that didn't exist in wartime Britain. Then one morning, staring at a cutaway diagram of the SU carburetor, she had the breakthrough. She'd been thinking about it all wrong. The problem wasn't the carburetor itself. The problem was too much fuel flooding the system during a negative G. So why was she trying to redesign the entire carburetor? Why not just limit the fuel? Not completely. Just enough to prevent flooding. It was so simple she almost laughed. If too much fuel is the problem, restrict the fuel flow. A brass disc, a precisely drilled hole in the center. Install it in the fuel line before the carburetor. Size the hole to allow exactly enough fuel for maximum power and nothing more. The engine would still get everything it needed, just not enough to drown itself. She pulled out her lathe and machined the first prototype herself. A brass disc 1 inch in diameter with a hole drilled through the center. She started with a hole size of 0.05 inches. Too much flow. The engine still flooded during simulated negative G. She tried 0.03 inches. Too restrictive. The engine starved at full throttle. 0.45 inches. Close, but not quite right. 0.042 inches. Better. 0.04 inches. Perfect. She tested 17 different hole sizes over 6 weeks. Each test required precise measurements, careful calculations, and endless simulations. She ran the Merlin engine on test stands in every possible configuration. Level flight, climbing, diving. Negative G, positive G, inverted, sustained. Maneuvers. With the 0.04 inch restrictor installed, engine cutouts dropped from 2 seconds to a fraction of a heartbeat. Too brief to matter in combat, the engine got exactly enough fuel for full power, but not enough to flood the supercharger. The bench tests were perfect. Absolutely perfect. She documented everything, wrote detailed reports, prepared technical specifications, ran the numbers again and again to make absolutely certain she hadn't missed anything. But bench tests aren't combat. Bench tests don't have Messerschmitts shooting at you. Bench tests don't have adrenaline clouding your judgment. Bench tests don't have tracer rounds screaming past your canopy while you're trying to keep a diving aircraft under control. She needed to test it in an actual dogfight, and that's when the real problem emerged. March 17, 1941. Beatrice Shilling stood in her laboratory holding 6 brass restrictors in her hand. Each one weighed less than an ounce. Each one had cost maybe 6 pence to manufacture. Each one could save a pilot's life or kill him. She knew the regulations. Installing unauthorized modifications on RAF aircraft was a court-martial offense. The Air Ministry required 6 months of testing for any new component. Review committees, safety certifications, engineering boards, paperwork that moved through channels at the speed of bureaucracy. 6 months. In 6 months, how many more pilots would die? How many more engine failures? How many more Messerschmitts would escape because British fighters couldn't follow them into a dive. She did the math. If the current loss rate continued, another 60 to 80 pilots would die from carburetor-related failures before her restrictor received official authorization. 60 to 80 young men, 60 to 80 families receiving telegrams. 6 months? Pilots are dying today. She made her decision. She loaded her Norton motorcycle with tools, the 6 restrictors, and a welding kit, kicked the engine to life, and rode 40 miles through the English countryside to RAF Biggin Hill. The morning was cold and gray. The roads were muddy from recent rain. She rode in her leather jacket and goggles, the same gear she'd worn racing at Brooklands, her mind calculating distances and fuel consumption, and the precise wording she'd use when she asked someone to help her commit what was technically a criminal offense. Biggin Hill was one of Fighter Command's frontline stations. The airfield was scarred with bomb craters from recent Luftwaffe attacks. Ground crews swarmed over Spitfires and Hurricanes, preparing them for morning patrols. The smell of aviation fuel and oil hung in the cold air. She found the chief mechanic in one of the maintenance hangars, a sergeant named Harris, 16 years of experience maintaining Merlin engines, hands that knew every bolt and wire by touch, face weathered by years of working outside in all conditions. She showed him the brass restrictor, explained the physics in simple terms, the float chamber flooding, the negative G problem, how this tiny piece of brass would control the fuel flow and prevent the engine from cutting out. Harris turned the restrictor over in his oil-stained fingers. Such a small thing. Such a simple thing. "How do you know it works?" he asked. "Bench tests," Beatrice said. 6 weeks of them. Perfect results every time. Harris looked at her. "Bench tests aren't combat, miss." "I know," she said quietly. "That's why I'm here." There was a long silence. Ground crews moved around them, working on aircraft, shouting instructions to each other. In the distance, a Spitfire's Merlin engine roared to life for pre-flight checks. Harris looked at the restrictors in his hand. Then he looked at the Spitfires on the flight line, young pilots climbing into cockpits, young men who trusted their engines to keep them alive. "I've lost 11 pilots to engine cutouts," he said quietly. His voice was rough. 11 good men. Peterson, he had a wife and a baby daughter. Williams, kid from Yorkshire, couldn't have been more than 19. And MacLeod, Scottish lad. I am 20 years old. He was supposed to get married next month. He looked at Beatrice, looked at the restrictor in his hand. "If this thing works," he said slowly, "I don't care if the king himself hasn't authorized it." He picked up his welding kit and walked toward the nearest Spitfire. The installation took 2 minutes. Harris welded the restrictor into the fuel line between the fuel pump and the carburetor. The weld was clean, professional, invisible, unless you knew exactly where to look. The brass disc sat there, unremarkable, a tiny piece of metal that nobody would notice, unless it worked, or unless it failed, and a pilot died because of it. Flight Lieutenant Alan Christopher Deere. Everyone called him Al. He was a New Zealander, 23 years old, with 54 combat missions under his belt. 7 confirmed kills. He'd been shot down twice. Survived a mid-air collision that should have killed him. Walked away from a crash landing where his Spitfire cartwheeled across a field and broke into pieces. He was also one of the most vocal critics of the carburetor problem. He'd filed engine failure reports 4 times in the last 3 months, all during diving attacks, all ending with German aircraft escaping. On March 17th, his Spitfire was the first aircraft fitted with Beatrice Shilling's restrictor. He didn't know it. Nobody told him. Harris had installed it while Deere was at breakfast. If the modification failed, if it starved the engine or caused a catastrophic failure, Beatrice wanted the blame to fall on her alone, not on a pilot who'd had no choice in the matter. At 07:15, Deere climbed into his cockpit. Standard morning patrol. 2 hours over the channel, watching for German formations. Routine, except nothing was routine anymore when you were flying over occupied France with Germans looking for you. Beatrice stood at the edge of the airfield. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat, but her hands were perfectly still. Engineers learn to control their hands. You can't make precision adjustments when you're shaking. If the restrictor worked, Deer would never notice anything different. The engine would perform exactly as it should, and he'd land without knowing anything had changed. If it failed, if it starved the engine during takeoff, he'd crash before he reached 500 feet. If the weld cracked during -G, the restrictor would tear loose and block the fuel line completely. The engine would die and never restart. If the hole was sized wrong, even by 1/1000th of an inch, the engine might run fine in level flight but fail catastrophically during combat maneuvers. If I'm wrong, Beatrice thought, he falls out of the sky, and I spend the rest of my life knowing I killed him. The Spitfire's Merlin roared to life, 12 cylinders firing in perfect sequence, 1,030 horsepower shaking the airframe. Deer taxied to the runway, released the brakes, accelerated down the grass strip. The tail came up. The Spitfire lifted off, climbed into the gray English sky. Beatrice watched until the aircraft was a speck against the clouds. Then she waited. The minutes crawled past. Each one felt like an hour. She paced the edge of the airfield, checked her watch obsessively, calculated fuel consumption in her head. 2 hours of patrol, maybe 2.5, if Deer extended his route. Fuel burn rate at cruise power, reserve calculations, emergency landing options if something went wrong. Ground crews moved around her. Mechanics worked on other aircraft. Pilots stood in small groups, smoking cigarettes, telling jokes to ease the tension of waiting. The war continued around her as if nothing unusual was happening. For them, nothing was. For Beatrice, everything was. She'd tested engine modifications before, published papers on carburetor efficiency. I attended conferences, but she'd never gambled a man's life on her work, never sent someone into combat with a piece of equipment that existed only because she believed it would work. Belief wasn't proof, and if she was wrong, belief wouldn't bring Deer back. Harris found her at the 1-hour mark, brought her a cup of tea. She took it, but didn't drink. Her stomach was too knotted. "He's a good pilot," Harris said, watching the empty sky. "Best in the squadron. If anyone can test your gadget properly, it's him." Beatrice nodded. She'd chosen Deer for exactly that reason. Experienced, aggressive, the kind of pilot who'd push into a dive without hesitation, the kind of pilot who'd find out fast whether the restrictor worked or didn't. 90 minutes. The patrol should be ending soon. Deer would be turning back toward Biggin Hill. If everything had gone normally, if his engine hadn't failed over the channel, if he wasn't floating in a life jacket right now, watching his Spitfire sink into cold, gray water, if he wasn't already dead. 2 hours and 17 minutes later, Deer's Spitfire appeared over the airfield. Beatrice saw it first. She'd been watching the sky so intently, her eyes ached. One aircraft, no smoke trailing behind it, no visible damage, wings level, steady approach. Deer landed smoothly, taxied to dispersal, cut his engine, and climbed out of the cockpit. He was grinning. Pilots didn't grin after routine patrols. They looked tired, tense, relieved to be alive, exhausted from 2 hours of constant vigilance at 20,000 feet. Deer looked like a man who just discovered a secret. Harris reached him first. "Any problems with the engine, sir?" Deer pulled off his helmet. His hair was matted with sweat. Problems? That was the best the Merlins ever ran. He encountered 2 Bf-109s over the channel. They'd spotted him at 15,000 feet, turned to engage. Standard German tactics, they had altitude advantage, so they dove to pick up speed and energy. Deer had followed the dive that should have killed his engine. Full -G, stick pushed hard forward, the horizon tilting, the channel rushing up, the Messerschmitts growing larger in his gun sight. And the Merlin never stuttered. Full power through the entire maneuver. Smooth, responsive, perfect. Deer had closed to 150 yards before the German pilots realized something was wrong. British fighters didn't follow them into dives. British fighters broke off, their engines cut out. But Deer was still there, still closing, still firing. He'd hit one of them. Watched pieces fly off the Messerschmitt's tail section. The German had limped toward France, trailing smoke, barely staying airborne. First confirmed damage Deer had scored in a diving attack since August. "I don't know what maintenance did to this aircraft," Deer said, still grinning, "but I want it done to every Spitfire in the squadron, every single one." Harris looked at Beatrice. Beatrice looked at the ground. "I think that can be arranged, sir," Harris said quietly. "News travels fast in wartime, especially good news. Especially when that good news means you might actually survive tomorrow's mission." Within 48 hours of Al Deer's successful test flight, every single aircraft at RAF Biggin Hill had a restrictor installed. Harris and his ground crew worked through the night. 2 minutes per aircraft, weld the brass disc into the fuel line. Check the installation, move to the next Spitfire. By dawn on March 19th, the entire squadron was modified. And then the phone calls started. Squadron commanders from Hornchurch called first. They'd heard rumors, something about Biggin Hill's pilots suddenly being able to follow German fighters into dives without engine failures. "What did you do? How do we get it?" Then Kenley called, then Tangmere, then Northolt, then Manston. Within 72 hours, every fighter station in southern England knew that Biggin Hill had solved the carburetor problem. They didn't know how. They didn't know what. They just knew that Biggin Hill's kill rates had suddenly doubled while their loss rates dropped. And they all wanted whatever Biggin Hill had. The Air Ministry found out within a week. Beatrice Shilling expected fury. She'd installed unauthorized modifications on combat aircraft. She'd bypassed every regulation, ignored every protocol, and committed what was technically a court-martial offense. She expected her career to end, expected threats, expected to be escorted out of Farnborough by military police. Instead, she got a phone call, March 24th, 1941. 08:30 hours, her laboratory phone rang. "Miss Shilling, this is Air Vice Marshal Keith Park." Keith Park, commander of No. 11 Group, the man responsible for every fighter squadron defending London and southeast England. The man who'd led Fighter Command through the worst days of the Battle of Britain. One of the most senior officers in the RAF. Beatrice's hand tightened on the phone. "Yes, sir." "I've just read the combat reports from Biggin Hill over the past week," Park said. His voice was clipped, precise, no-nonsense New Zealand accent. "I'm told you're responsible for the modifications." Beatrice braced herself. "Yes, sir." There was a brief pause. "How fast can you install this device in every aircraft in Fighter Command?" Beatrice blinked. "Sir?" "You heard me. How fast?" She did the math in her head. 43 fighter stations across southern and central England. Roughly 3,000 Merlin engines. If she trained installation teams at each base, worked around the clock, prioritized frontline squadrons. 6 weeks, she said. Maybe 5 if Rolls-Royce can manufacture the restrictors fast enough. "You have 4, Park said. "I'll handle the authorization. You handle the installation. Don't let me down." The line went dead. Beatrice stood there, phone in hand, staring at nothing. 4 weeks, 3,000 engines, 43 stations. She hung up the phone and got to work. Beatrice assembled a team of 3 engineers from Farnborough, young men who knew Merlin engines inside and out. She gave them each a stack of restrictors, welding equipment, and instructions. Then she planned her route like a military campaign. Frontline squadrons first. The stations that saw daily combat. Biggin Hill was already done. Next, Hornchurch, Kenley, Tangmere, Northolt, Manston. Then work outward to the reserve squadrons. Then the training units. cover the entire southeast, then push north. She loaded her Norton motorcycle with tools, restrictors, technical specifications, and nothing else. No spare clothes, no comfort items, just the equipment she needed to save lives. And then she rode, station to station, base to base, through the English countryside that was preparing for invasion, past anti-aircraft batteries and roadblocks and home guard checkpoints. 40, 50, sometimes 60 miles between stations. She trained the ground crews personally at each base, showed them exactly how to install the restrictor, where to weld it, how to check the installation, how to verify the hole diameter was correct. She supervised the first fittings at every station. I watched the mechanics work, checked every weld with her own eyes, measured every hole diameter with her own calipers. If a restrictor didn't meet her exact specifications, if the hole was even 1/1000th of an inch off, if the brass disc had any imperfections, if the weld looked weak, she rejected it. Pilots' lives depended on these tiny pieces of brass being perfect. She wouldn't accept anything less. She slept in hangars when there was time to sleep, curled up in a corner on a canvas cot, still in her motorcycle leathers, catching 3 or 4 hours before the next day's installations began. She ate sandwiches on her motorcycle when there wasn't time to stop. Riding between stations, one hand on the throttle, one hand holding bread and cheese, eyes on the muddy roads. She rode through spring rain that turned the roads to rivers of mud. She rode while German bombers occasionally passed overhead. The Luftwaffe was still launching raids, still trying to break British morale. Once she had to pull off the road and take shelter in a ditch while a Heinkel He 111 flew low overhead, its engines thundering, heading toward London with a bomb load. When the bomber passed, she climbed back on her Norton and kept riding. At one station, she never said which one publicly, but the story spread through Fighter Command anyway. A wing commander refused to authorize the installation, told her to come back when she had proper paperwork from the Air Ministry, proper approvals, proper documentation. Beatrice pulled out a single sheet of paper. Air Vice Marshal Keith Park's direct authorization, signed, stamped, official. The wing commander read it, went pale, stammered an apology. "The installation proceeds now," Beatrice said. "Your pilots are dying. We don't have time for bureaucracy." The installation proceeded. At another station, a young pilot, couldn't have been more than 20, watched her supervise the installation on his Spitfire. Watched this woman in motorcycle gear checking welds and measuring components while his ground crew followed her instructions without question. "Excuse me, miss," he said. "What did you do to deserve such an important job?" Beatrice looked at him, covered in grease and oil, exhausted, running on too little sleep and too much coffee. "I'm good at it," she said simply. The pilot thought about that for a moment, then nodded. "Fair enough." By April 20th, 1941, every Spitfire and Hurricane in Fighter Command had a restrictor fitted. 2,147 Merlin engines, 43 stations, 4 weeks of nonstop work. The device needed an official name for the technical reports and maintenance logs. The Royal Aircraft Establishment called it the RAE restrictor. Formal, professional. Appropriate for official documentation, the pilots called it something else entirely. Sir Stanley Hooker, chief engineer at Rolls-Royce, heard about the modification and examined one of the restrictors himself. He was impressed and perhaps a bit embarrassed that his company's 3-year solution had been beaten by a woman with a brass washer and a drill. He gave it the nickname that stuck, Miss Shilling's Orifice. Crude RAF humor, a dirty joke. The kind of thing young men laughed about in mess halls and dispersal huts. When someone told Beatrice what the pilots were calling her invention, they expected her to be offended, scandalized. She was a professional woman in a man's world. Surely she'd demand they use the proper technical name. Instead, she smiled. "If a dirty joke helps pilots remember who saved them," she said, "I'll take it." The statistics tell the story better than any words can. March 1941, before the restrictor, engine cutouts during diving attacks, 41%, kill-to-loss ratio, 1.4 to 1, British fighters lost. 51 German aircraft destroyed, 73rd April 1941, after. The restrictor, engine cutouts during diving attacks, 0.3%, kill-to-loss ratio, 3.1 to 1, British fighters lost. 27 German aircraft destroyed, 84. The transformation was immediate, measurable, undeniable. Nearly half of all diving attacks had ended in engine failure. Now, less than 1 in 300 failed. British losses dropped by nearly half. German losses increased. The balance of air combat shifted in a single month. But the statistics don't capture what really changed. They don't capture the confidence. Pilot Officer Robert Stanford Tuck, one of the RAF's top aces, wrote a letter to his family in late April. "It's like flying a different aircraft," he wrote. "Before, every dive was a gamble. Would the engine keep running or wouldn't it? You'd hesitate for just a moment, and that moment could kill you. Now there's no hesitation. The Merlin runs perfectly, no matter what I do. I can fight the way I've always wanted to fight." Pilot Officer Johnny Johnson flew his first combat missions in April 1941. He'd go on to become the RAF's top-scoring ace of the entire war with 38 confirmed kills. Years later, he'd recall, "The older pilots told me about the engine failures. They said you had to be careful while diving. Your Merlin might quit on you. By the time I started flying combat, that problem was gone. Miss Shilling had fixed it. I never thought twice about diving in Germany. That probably saved my life a dozen times." Squadron leader Douglas Bader, the legendary pilot who flew with 2 artificial legs, credited the restrictor with fundamentally changing RAF tactics. "Before Shilling, we fought defensively," he said. "We were afraid of our own engines. After Shilling, we fought the way fighter pilots are supposed to fight. Aggressive, committed, no hesitation. She gave us our confidence back." Al Deere, the pilot who'd unknowingly tested the first restrictor, learned weeks later that he'd been the guinea pig. When Beatrice finally told him what she'd done installing an unauthorized, untested modification in his aircraft without his knowledge, he could have been furious. He could have reported her, could have demanded an investigation. Instead, he shook her hand. "I wasn't angry," he wrote in his memoirs years later. "I was grateful. She took a risk on me so that thousands of other pilots wouldn't have to take the same risk. That takes courage." The Luftwaffe noticed within weeks. German intelligence officers reviewed after-action reports from April and saw the pattern. British fighters were no longer breaking off diving attacks. The tactical advantage had evaporated. Pilots who'd relied on the English disease to escape were suddenly getting shot down. By May 1941, German tactical manuals had quietly removed the entire section about exploiting British engine failures during negative G maneuvers. The advice was no longer relevant. The weakness no longer existed. The English disease had been cured by a woman with a brass washer, a motorcycle, and the courage to break every rule that needed breaking. And the war continued. But now, British pilots had a fighting chance. May 1943, 2 years after Beatrice Shilling's brass restrictor saved Fighter Command. Rolls-Royce finally delivered their proper solution, the pressure carburetor. 3 years of development, millions of pounds invested, engineering perfection. Everything the Air Ministry had been waiting for since 1940. The new carburetor used direct fuel injection principles similar to German engines. No float chamber, no flooding risk, no need for a restrictor. A complete redesign that eliminated the negative G problem at its source. It was brilliant, sophisticated, exactly what the textbook said you were supposed to do, and Fighter Command barely used it. The problem wasn't the carburetor itself. The problem was installation time. Converting a Merlin engine from the old SU carburetor to the new pressure system required 8 hours of work per aircraft. 8 hours of complete engine teardown, modification, reassembly, and testing. 8 hours meant grounding squadrons, 8 hours meant aircraft, sitting in hangars instead of protecting Britain's skies. 8 hours meant fewer combat-ready fighters at a time when the RAF was supporting bomber raids deep into occupied Europe. Fighter Command looked at the numbers. They had roughly 3,000 Merlin engines in service. 8 hours per engine meant 24,000 man-hours of work. Even working around the clock, converting the entire force would take months. Months when those aircraft couldn't fly missions. Months when German fighters would have numerical advantage. And for what? To replace a system that already worked perfectly? Beatrice Shilling's restrictor took 2 minutes to install, cost less than £1 to manufacture, never failed in combat. Pilots trusted it. Ground crews knew how to maintain it. It had been in service for 2 years with 0 complaints and spectacular results. So Fighter Command made a decision that would have seemed insane to engineers and bureaucrats. They kept the brass washers. The pressure carburetors went into new aircraft coming off production lines. Fresh Spitfires, new Hurricanes. Aircraft that hadn't been built yet could get the proper solution from the factory. But the thousands of aircraft already in service, the battle-hardened Spitfires that had fought through 1941 and 1942, the Hurricanes that veterans flew because they knew every sound and vibration, those kept Miss Shilling's orifice. Many aircraft flew with the restrictor until 1944. Some until the war ended in 1945. 4 years of combat operations, thousands of missions, tens of thousands of diving attacks, all protected by a piece of brass with a hole drilled through it. The irony was profound and perfect. A stopgap solution, installed in violation of regulations by a woman nobody had heard of, kept British pilots alive for 4 years, while the proper engineering solution waited in the wings. Engineers hate shortcuts. They're trained to distrust simple solutions. They want comprehensive redesigns, extensive testing, proper documentation. But sometimes the shortcut is the answer. Sometimes simple is better than sophisticated. Beatrice Shilling understood that in her bones. Racing at Brooklands had taught her, the machine that works is better than the machine that's theoretically perfect. The restrictor made her famous, well, famous among pilots and mechanics, if not the general public. But Beatrice didn't stop working, didn't coast on that one success. She had a war to win, and engines were still breaking in ways that killed people. Winter 1943. British Spitfires were being shipped to the Soviet Union through the Arctic port of Murmansk. Part of the Lend-Lease program, Britain sending aircraft to help Russia fight Germany on the Eastern Front. The Russians loved Spitfires, fast, maneuverable, beautiful aircraft. There was just one problem. They wouldn't start. Murmansk in winter is one of the coldest places on Earth. Temperatures drop to 40 degrees below zero. At that temperature, fuel lines froze solid. Batteries died in minutes. Engine oil turned to sludge thick as honey. Russian mechanics would spend hours trying to coax frozen Spitfires to life, often giving up and leaving the aircraft grounded until spring. The file landed on Beatrice's desk with a note from the Air Ministry. "Can you fix this?" She studied the problem for 3 weeks, read reports from Russian mechanics, analyzed the Merlin's cold start characteristics, ran tests in Farnborough's refrigerated testing chamber, pushing temperatures down until components failed, then figuring out why. The solution was elegantly simple. Preheat the oil, not the engine, not the fuel, just the oil. Get the oil warm enough to flow, and everything else would follow. She designed a portable heating system that Russian ground crews could use with whatever equipment they had available. Kerosene heaters, steam generators, even fires built in metal drums. Then she wrote a manual, not in technical English, that required translators and engineering degrees, in simple, Clear language with illustrations showing exactly what to do, step by step. Idiot-proof. Russian mechanics followed her instructions. Spitfires that had been frozen and useless roared to life in conditions that should have been impossible. Through the brutal winter of 1944, British fighters flew combat missions over frozen Russian landscapes, protecting Soviet bomber formations and intercepting German aircraft. Because a woman in England had figured out how to make oil flow at 40 below zero. Then came high-altitude research. By 1944, late-war Spitfires were flying missions at 35,000 feet. Air that thin, that cold, that starved of oxygen created new problems. Fuel mixture went wrong. Power output dropped. Engines that ran perfectly at 20,000 feet struggled and gasped at extreme altitude. Beatrice developed altitude-compensating modifications that improved power output by 8% above 30,000 feet. Not a dramatic number. Not revolutionary. Just 8% more power when you needed it most, when you were higher than any human had a right to be, hunting German reconnaissance aircraft that flew where most fighters couldn't reach them. 8% doesn't sound like much. But when you're at 35,000 feet and a German is pulling away from you, 8% is the difference between catching him and watching him escape. By 1945, Beatrice Shilling had completed 17 major projects. Cold starts, high-altitude performance, fuel system reliability, engine cooling. Each one saved lives. Each one solved a problem that was killing pilots. None of them achieved the fame of the restrictor. She didn't care about fame. While she was working those long hours at Farnborough, her husband George Naylor was flying bombers with 625 Squadron, Lancaster heavy bombers, night raids over Germany. 31 missions into defended airspace where searchlights turned night into day and German fighters prowled in the darkness. Bomber Command had the highest casualty rate of any service in the war. One crew in two didn't survive their tour of duty. 50-50 odds. Every time George climbed into that Lancaster, statistics said he might not come back. Beatrice calculated probability for a living. She knew exactly how thin the margin was, knew that every mission was a roll of dice loaded against survival. She couldn't protect him, couldn't engineer a solution to flak and night fighters and navigation errors that put bombers over the wrong target where defenses were heaviest. All she could do was work, keep other people's husbands alive, trust that George's skill and luck would bring him home. He beat the odds, earned the Distinguished Flying Cross, came home in 1944. They never talked about what he'd seen over Germany. He never asked about her work. Some things were too heavy to carry in conversation. Some weights you bore alone. Buckingham Palace. King George VI appointed Beatrice Shilling an officer of the Order of the British Empire. She wore her best dress, stood in a room full of decorated officers and distinguished citizens, received her medal from the king himself, posed for photographs, smiled for the cameras. A reporter asked her the secret to her success. Solving problems, she said. That's all engineering is. Someone has a problem. You find a solution. You make it work. Was being a woman in a male profession difficult? She shrugged. I didn't have time to think about being a woman. I was too busy being an engineer. The next morning, she was back at Farnborough working on jet engine problems. New technology, new challenges. The Merlin was yesterday's engine. Jets were the future, and they had their own set of issues that needed solving. She never reached director-level positions at the Royal Aircraft Establishment. Those positions were reserved for men. Unwritten rules nobody acknowledged, but everyone followed. The kind of barriers that didn't announce themselves, but were absolutely real. She never complained publicly, never filed grievances or demanded promotions she deserved. Maybe she didn't care. Maybe she preferred real engineering to the paperwork and politics that came with senior management. Maybe she'd learned long ago that fighting some battles wasn't worth the energy. Or maybe she just kept her head down and did the work because the work mattered more than recognition. Her post-war career included work on the Blue Streak missile program and research into wet runway braking systems, the technology that helps modern aircraft land safely in rain. Then, in 1967, something remarkable happened. Dan Gurney's Eagle Mk1 Formula One car had an overheating problem. The engine ran too hot during races. Performance suffered. The car couldn't compete. Gurney's team of engineers, young, brilliant, university-educated specialists, couldn't solve it. Someone suggested calling the old lady who fixed the Spitfires. Beatrice Shilling was 58 years old. She looked at the cooling system for 2 hours, traced coolant flow, measured temperatures, asked questions, made calculations on a notepad. Then she told them what to change. The engineers, half her age, trained in the latest techniques, implemented her solution. The overheating problem disappeared. The Eagle ran perfectly. "It's the same as any other engine problem," she said. "You understand physics. You find the simplest solution. You make it work." Beatrice Shilling retired in 1969. She'd spent 33 years at Farnborough, 33 years solving problems that killed people if you got them wrong. She spent her final years the same way she'd spent her first, working on motorcycles, restoring vintage machines, racing at classic events, maintaining the Norton she'd owned since she was 14 years old, the motorcycle that had taught her how engines behave under stress, the machine that had started everything. She died November 18, 1990, 81 years old. The obituaries focused on one thing: the brass washer. Everything else, the cold start systems, the high-altitude research, the 17 other projects, the decades of quiet excellence, became footnotes. One invention, one moment of courage. That's what the world remembered. Today, there's a pub in Farnborough called the Tilly Shilling. Brooklyn's museum displays her racing trophies. Universities have buildings bearing her name. Engineering schools teach the restrictor as a case study in elegant problem solving. Simple solution, immediate implementation, measurable results. But the real lesson isn't about engineering, it's about courage. In March 1941, Beatrice Shilling had a choice: follow procedure, wait for authorization, attend committee meetings, file reports, let the system work at the speed of bureaucracy while pilots died at the speed of combat, or load a motorcycle with brass washers and fix the problem herself. She chose to act, risked her career, her reputation, maybe her freedom. Installed an unauthorized modification and sent a pilot into battle without telling him what she'd done. If she'd been wrong, she would have been court-martialed, imprisoned, destroyed. Her name would be remembered as the woman who killed a pilot with her arrogance. She wasn't wrong. Thousands of pilots came home because of what she did. Thousands of families stayed whole. Thousands of futures lived instead of being buried in military cemeteries across England. One woman, one motorcycle, one brass washer with a hole in it, and the courage to act when everyone else was waiting for permission. That's how you change history. If this story moved you, smash that like button. Everyone likes YouTube to share this forgotten piece of history. Subscribe if you haven't already. We're bringing you more incredible untold World War II stories every week. Comment below. What other unsung heroes should I cover next? I read every single comment. And here's something wild. Next week, I'm covering the spy who saved D-Day using nothing but a dead body and a fake love letter. Trust me, you won't believe it. Until then, remember, heroes come in all forms. Sometimes they wear uniforms. Sometimes they wear motorcycle boots and carry wrenches. See you next time.